Test, test. There. That is indeed on. Method- Well, folks, I know that we do have some people wanting to be out of here right at 2:30 so that they can get their painting on. And so we'll go ahead and start now. And hopefully today I won't fall behind, but we'll just see because there's not a next time. So welcome to the folks joining us on 966 in our live stream. We are here for our sixth and final episode of the Apostles. And so today we're going to be looking at sort of the apostles who are not apostles. We're going to end, so if you remember back in September when we did our first one, I talked about how there's sort of 15 or 16 people listed as apostles in the New Testament, in the various Acts of the Apostles and the letters of Paul, and in the New Testament and in the Gospels. And so there's a few of them that show up, but then really there's nothing else about them. So there's like three people that we aren't going to really talk about. They're just mentioned briefly in one of the letters of Paul that sort of, could be translated one way or translated another way, that they are either apostles or they're known to the apostles. That's one of the ways that they end up often trying to deal with the issue of, well, there's only supposed to be 12 of them. And so we end up having a handful of folks that we're just going to ignore. But today we're going to talk about about three folks that are sort of in that realm of apostles, but because of one reason or another aren't sort of universally, acclaimed as such. So we're going to talk about Judas Iscariot, who was definitely there the entire time that Jesus was doing his public ministry, but then after things, all fell out on Holy Week, Judas sort of disappeared. He ended up, according to at least Mark and Matthew, he ended up dying by suicide. Then we have after Judas's death, they end up, the disciples come back, or the apostles come back, and they say, well, we need to go back up to 12 because there were 12 tribes of Israel, so we should have 12 apostles. And so they end up saying, well, here are two folks, and we'll choose one of them. And so Matthias was chosen, and he ends up being appointed as an apostle, and then is never heard from again. But then we also have this weird situation where Paul ends up claiming that he is an apostle, that he's one that has been sent. And oftentimes we end up seeing this happen in terms of sort of church teaching, or what really actually happens. That, we put Paul right there with Peter and, some of the other disciples because of the situation with his writings. I mean, his letters are still with us this day, and they end up giving a lot of instruction upon the church, how the church was supposed to function, and also on theological belief. And so oftentimes when we think about, folks who are sent, Paul will be considered an apostle, even though he never met Jesus in person, or at least while Jesus was still here on earth. And he has a sketchy past. But it seems that Paul sort of takes that role of the 12th apostle better than Matthias. So anyway, we're going to just do a quick little review. So we want to remember that the word apostle comes from Greek, where apo means sent away from, for, or off, and stello is to send. So apostles are literally one who is sent off or one who is sent away, and they are often considered maybe messengers. So if you're talking about an apostle or apostolos in Greek, it could be someone who's sent as a messenger, given something to share with other folks. But it usually indicates someone who has some power to negotiate or to do something more than just for a message. So it's more like ambassador or delegate rather than just a message. Right. I mean, so we have to remember that this is the Greek word, and the Greek word apostolos is a messenger or an ambassador. So it says we end up talking about the 12 apostles, but when we're thinking about the name apostle, it really is that ambassador. So they are ambassadors for Christ. They don't necessarily have to be him. I mean, we could end up talking about ourselves as apostles, potentially, that we have that message to send, but we have more than just the message. We can actually do stuff. We, as Christ, can be ambassadors to bring the good news to all the world. So we can end up being the apostle, but when we look at the development of the term over centuries and millennia, it's come to really mean that group of 12. And so while the word is usable in many places, the practice of it being used really seems to be reserved for those 12. So we're going to talk about Judas Iscariot. And so Judas Iscariot, his name is a variation on the Hebrew or Jewish name Judah. Let's see if I turn off this light, if that makes it a little bit easier. Does that make it easier to see? Okay, so Judas Iscariot, his name is a variation on the name Judah, which was really the one tribe that really stayed intact after the Babylonian exile. So if we remember, the northern kingdom of Israel had 10 tribes. They were taken over by the Syrians, and they ended up intermarrying, and so the people lost some of the tribal connections. Whereas Judah was the southern kingdom, and that, along with Benjamin and a couple other sub-tribes, they ended up forming the kingdom of Judah, and they went into exile in Babylon, but then were able to return and retain their identity. So Judas is really a variation on the name Judah, and Iscariot. Some folks have made some wild ideas that, well, it means man of the dagger. It doesn't. Iscariot probably is saying the is, the is means man from, and kariot. So this would be the transliteration of the Hebrew, of kariot. So he's a man from Kariot. We don't know anything else other than that. So when we look at the different places in the New Testament where things are talked about, Matthew, he's called Judas Iscariot. Mark, he's called Judas Iscariot. Luke, he's called Judas Iscariot. And John, he's called Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. So Simon being from Kariot. So, but then, of course, in Acts, he's not mentioned because he's dead. So when we end up looking at how Judas shows up in the New Testament, there are a number of pieces where we see him regularly come up. So in the Gospels, there's definitely a conspiracy that he has with the high priest, where he ends up going to them and saying, hey, what will you give me if I betray Jesus to you? And they pay him 30 pieces of silver. So we can end up seeing this in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. And Mark, one of the briefer ones, says, then one of the 12, who's called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, what will you give me if I betray him to you? They paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he began to look for an opportunity to betray him. So we have that. We also have him being accused by Jesus at the Last Supper. The one who will betray me will be dipping his bread in the oil with me right now. And, Jesus says, the Son of Man goes as is written of him, but woe to that one whom the Son of Man has betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born. Judas, who betrayed him, said, surely not I, Rabbi. Jesus replied, you have said so. So we have these interactions, and then we have that final betrayal in the garden. And so they're at the Garden of Gethsemane, and while Jesus was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man, arrest him." And at once he came up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you are here to do." Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and arrested him. So we have that, but then we also have a point where after Jesus has died, after he's been totally crucified and he's not going to be able to get out of things, he ends up seeing a change of heart. And it's there in Mark and also in Matthew, where when Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. He said, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." But they said, "What is that to us? See to it yourself." Throwing down the 30 pieces of silver in the temple, he departed and went and hanged himself. So there's actually a little variation about whether he hanged himself or died by suicide, exactly how, but that's really rather minor. All we know is that he did end up dying before Jesus was resurrected. One of the interesting things is Luke and John both attribute Judas's actions to being taken over by Satan, that Satan has caused him to do this. And so that is just a interesting little side note. But we also have John really having Judas put some nails in his coffin. So when Mary, the sister of Lazarus and Martha, has Jesus at the house, she ends up bringing out a pound of nard, which is a perfuming kind of substance that is pretty darn expensive. And Judas ends up taking, and she anoints Jesus' feet with it. And Judas's response is, in reading from John 12, 4 through 6, but Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, the one who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse and used to steal what was put into it. So they had a common purse among the disciples so that, if you needed a little bit of extra money to buy food or whatever else, here you go. Well, Judas was stealing from that and was thinking, hey, you could have sold this for 300 denarii so I could have pocketed more of it myself. So we have these elements there, and so those are common agreement. And so really, at the end of the story, he's not going out there sharing the news with anyone because he's dead. But there is a bit more that ends up coming along with Judas. So there's actually a Gospel of Judas that is found out in fragments and little pieces here and there. And this picture here at the left is actually of the first page of the Gospel according to Judas. And what ends up happening in the late first century, so right around 100, but pushing closer to the middle of the second century, about 150, we have something called Gnosticism. So Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. And Gnosticism is a sort of spiritualizing practice or spiritualizing ideal that says that some people are given special knowledge of God, and those people get it, and the other folks, they just don't. And one of the things that Gnosticism ends up taking on in Christianity is the idea that the God of the Old Testament isn't really the God and Father of Jesus Christ. The God of the Old Testament is called a demiurge. He's the one that put together the world of matter, of things, and is not the creator of all that is, but the one that created the world, and the world is fallen and broken and highly problematic. But then there's another God that shows up, the monad, or the God of the spiritual realm. And he's actually the father of Jesus. And so Jesus was here on a mission to free people from this physical stuff to really focus on the spiritual. And so if you see this as an issue, well, Judas suddenly becomes a hero, because Judas is there helping Jesus shed the material and fully reveal the spiritual aspect of him. Now, does this sound like Christianity at all that you've ever heard of? Of course not. It's a heresy. If you believe this stuff, you're a heretic. We won't burn you at a stake, but you're still a heretic. But this is going on, and folks are saying that Judas was the one who secretly made these arrangements with Jesus because Jesus told him the secret knowledge, the gnosis, and by that he was able to, help Jesus fulfill the quest to get rid of his bodily, earthly frame and put on fully spiritual. And so that becomes part of this Gnosticism. Obviously, Christianity said, no, this is the same God, and God made all of creation, not just part of it. And we are good even in our bodies. So Judas ends up getting a better treatment in Gnosticism, but really doesn't have much going on for anything else. So thinking about what you've heard about Judas, what does this help us understand? What takeaways might be there for us as we consider him as an apostle? And it may not be much, but go ahead and take a moment. And Richard, can I ask you to join Jack and Carol so that it's a little bit easier to have a conversation with three people than just one? So talk amongst yourselves for a few minutes and we'll come back. Yeah. Okay, so what are some of the things that you were hearing at your tables? Judas was a hero. Okay. Tell me about that.
Someone had to betray Christ in order to start that process of crucifixion.
Yeah. I'll end up repeating it.
Someone had to betray Christ in order to start the process through the crucifixion.
Yeah.
I don't think he really wanted to, but he was assigned that job.
Yeah.
You are the one that was picked to betray me. You may not like it, but if somebody has to, and he was picked the apostle to do it.
Yeah. And so this becomes a sticking point in theology, quite honestly. So, Richard was saying, well, he needed to be, we needed someone to start the process into Christ's, betrayal so that he could be crucified and then dead and buried and finally resurrected. And so there's actually some folks that end up talking about this, saying, okay, is this predestination, which the good Calvinists would say, absolutely, this was God's plan. And then they would end up saying, so does that mean that Judas really is condemned forever? And some would actually say, no, he's not. I mean, because we end up hearing Jesus say, woe to the one who does this, who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better that he not be born, but his part was needed in the story. So if it was Satan who came in and caused him to do that, or if it was God's direction, well, where is accountability there? Where does he really have, full accountability? And we also see that he repented, took the money back, and then he was so distraught, he, died himself. Now, there is a story that goes around from the must have been late 2nd century, maybe even the 3rd century, that, Judas went home and talked to his wife and said, I betrayed him and he died, and, he's going to be resurrected. And she said, and she was working on a fried chicken dinner or something. She had butchered a chicken, was pulling the feathers off, and she said, you're talking crazy stuff. If Jesus is going to be resurrected, then this chicken will come back to life right now and start walking around. And lo and behold, the chicken did. And then he went and hung himself. I mean, there's just some weird stories out there, folks. And church, church fathers, church mothers, early church folks said, yeah, that ain't happening. Yeah, Lucy.
I'm not sure this is relevant, but what is the value? They say on the approximately of the 30 pieces of silver. Now, some of my partners here at the table said that was a lot of money. And I'm not arguing that it wasn't, but what's the cost to betray someone? What's the cost to betray your Savior?
Yeah.
I mean, yes, he lost his life. He took his own life as part of that payment.
Yeah.
But were those the silver
Yeah.
significant impact, or was he just greedy?
The 30 pieces of silver is not fully clear how much it really was. At least in my mind right now, I could probably go look it up and see, but it probably was, a few $100s. It wouldn't have been a huge amount, but it would have been like a day's wage, well, probably maybe a month's wage. But one of the things that, some scholars have suggested, trying to give Judas a different point of view, maybe redeeming him a little bit, was they said, well, he really wasn't concerned about the money. What he wanted to do was force Jesus into a spot where he had to declare himself as the Messiah and then lead the uprising that would overthrow the Romans and push them out. That Judas was stuck on this idea of what the Messiah was supposed to be, the military leader.
He wasn't living up to his own image.
Right. And so there's some folks that suggest that, again, we don't have a whole lot to go on in the Gospels. I mean, we have that he's a thief according to Luke, according to John. So, and then Ellie. Yeah. Yeah, he's really a two-dimensional figure. I mean, Peter, James, John, we get a full view of them, warts and all. But Judas is really there as just a cardboard cutout. So we go from one cardboard cutout to another that's even more so. So Matthias. We end up having Matthias being selected as an apostle to bring the number up to 12. We don't know anything else really about him because he shows up in 3 verses in Acts. So it says in Acts 1:23, so the apostles proposed 2 to take Judas's place. Joseph called Barsabbas, who is also known as Justus, and Matthias. Then they prayed and said, Lord, you know everyone's heart. Show us which one of these 2 you have chosen to take the place in ministry and apostleship from which Judas turned aside to go his own place. And they cast lots for them, and the lot fell on Matthias, and he was added to the 11 apostles. So what I get from this is that gambling is absolutely allowed in church. Because that's what they were doing when they were casting lots. It's a gambling game. Chance of luck, so throw the dice and see who comes up. I mean, that's essentially it. And then, you probably can't see this, but this is a statue of Matthias, but it's only his back. I found it really interesting that the picture I could find, because normally I'd gotten a picture from like Rubens or Rembrandt of the apostles on the first page, and then the second page I'd have a big old statue in Rome, and here we have just his back with this pike. He's holding an axe, a pole axe, because he was possibly stoned to death and then beheaded using an axe. So remember, saints usually carry around the way that they died. You remember Bartholomew? He was carrying around his skin because he died because he was, flayed. He was skinned alive. There's people that say he went to Ethiopia or to the Caucasus region. Again, then he was beheaded. He was stoned and then beheaded or died of old age. But because he only shows up in 3 verses of Acts of the Apostles, no one really talks much about him. It's not something that they go on. There is a fragment that is seen of the Gospel of Matthias. We don't have much about it, and it was considered apocryphal as well. So it just wasn't anything to write home about. So there we go. That was one of them. I mean, it took us all of 3 minutes. Not really much we can pull out. I mean, it's sort of like when we were thinking. Yeah. So why don't you chat about what I shared, if anything, just for a minute or two at your tables. That's something I forgot to mention. Yeah. Yeah. So what are some of the things that came up at your tables? What were some of the things you were talking about at your tables? Yeah, they needed 12, so here's your warm body. Well, I mean, 12 again, Jesus intentionally chose 12 apostles to be sort of the core group that would end up, sort of emulating the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 sons of Jacob. And then they end up going, so we drop down, and so we need to get someone. Now, one of the things I forgot to highlight is that they end up choosing two people. So this Joseph Barsabas, and who is also called Justus, and Matthias, they are from folks that have been with Jesus from the beginning. So there's a group, there's a larger group than just the 12. Because remember, Jesus sends out 70 different disciples to do the ministry, and they go and they heal people and bring good news, and then they come back and report. So there are folks that have been with Jesus the whole time, but they're not part of the 12. And so both of these guys have been going along, and they knew Jesus from the very beginning. So, yeah, he didn't get written up. He didn't get into the yeah. And so, poor PR. And, one of the things that I say about church board meetings, so session meetings, if it's not in the minutes, it didn't happen. I mean, so he didn't get recorded in there, so nothing happened. And so, but there are definitely those folks that are there in obscurity.
Maybe it was a person that just didn't like to take credit.
Yeah, he didn't like to take credit. He wanted to work in the background. Easily could be. We just don't know. But
We have no evidence of his mission.
right. Yeah. Well, and if we remember, we don't have much of mission for Thomas or Andrew, or, there's a whole list of these disciples, Bartholomew, Thaddeus. No, I think Thaddeus and Bartholomew are the same. You'd have to look. But there's just a whole list of folks that we don't have any stories told about them. And so we don't know what they've done according to biblical sources, according to Scripture. So, yeah, they worked in the background.
One thing that we always talk about nowadays, representation of districts, congressmen, senators. Now, when these 12 were chosen, they didn't represent the tribes. Really.
Yeah.
The
No.
individual tribes, like Matthias was such and such.
Yeah. No.
They just represented the message of Christ.
Right. Right. These folks were not chosen as, well, we're getting one from every tribe of Israel. Because remember, we still have the lost tribes of Israel. There's 10 of them disappeared because they got intermarried with the Assyrians. So instead we have, the tribe of Judah and Benjamin, and, there's also Joseph's sons that become their own separate tribe, but we won't go into all that. So we end up listening to this, and it's sort of like, okay, we have to have 12, but we don't have one from each tribe. This is not a representative democracy. We aren't looking for, okay, well, this crowd has, 35 prostitutes and 25 tax collectors, so we need a prostitute and a tax collector. Who wants to be your representatives? It's not doing that. It's Jesus choosing them and saying, you're the ones I want. And he does bring fishermen and tax collectors and folks that have different backgrounds, but it's not necessarily a representative sample of folks. So when we end up thinking about Matthias, he's sort of a written off character. And then we come to the last guy. So Paul, or Saul, however you want to name him, really does seem to take over the place of the 12th apostle. He really does seem to fit in and become that primary moving point for a lot of the Acts of the Apostles. In fact, fully, at least half, and I think it might be 2/3 of the Acts of the Apostles is following Paul and his missionary journeys. He ends up having journeys that take him all around the Roman Empire. He spends a lot of time in Asia province, which is Turkey, some time in Palestine, into Syria, but then he goes into Macedonia and Attica, into Greece, and then finally he does end up finding himself going to Rome. And so when we end up hearing about him as one of the core people in the Acts of the Apostles, we sort of say, well, of course, he was an apostle. And what we end up hearing from him is that he actually talks about his own identity a bit. And so we do have letters that he has written to different congregations, different people that are there in the New Testament, the epistles. Not all the epistles are by Paul, but a great number of them are. And so in Philippians 3, from the second part of verse 4 through verse 6, Paul says this about himself. And if anyone has any reason to be confident in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, a member of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. He's telling the Philippians, you guys, you get so caught up into being righteous and that you have all these benefits from being Jewish, and he's sort of like, I'm even better than you are. Now shut up. Because he goes on to say, it's not about me, it's not about my background, it's not about my righteousness, it's about Christ and him crucified and him resurrected. And so Saul is giving his identity that he is a Jew of the Jews. He's a Pharisee. He's one that has really studied the law. He lives it. He does his best. And the Pharisees are what become the group that founds what we talk about as modern-day Judaism. The Pharisaic tradition is what becomes modern Torah Judaism. The other thing that we have is that we often hear about Saul and Paul. And people sometimes say, well, he was Saul, but then he had the conversion experience on the road to Damascus and he changed his name to Paul. And quite honestly, that doesn't really hold water when you look at the biblical witness. Because when we get him into being among the people who are following Jesus, he's still called Saul sometimes. What folks have suggested that his name really is both Saul and Paul. That Saul is a name of the king of Israel, someone important in that lineage, even if he was a bit of a schmuck. He ends up, so he's named after that and called Saul among folks who are Jewish. But among folks that are, Gentiles, that are Greek-speaking, Paul becomes the main name for him. And so it's not unheard of for someone to have one name in a Jewish context and another name in a Gentile context. And so that's what the suggestion is. He's actually having both names at the same time. It just depends on whether he's in a Greek context or a Jewish context about what name he's using. Now, it doesn't play hard and fast in Acts of the Apostles. You'll see him talked about as Paul in some places where he's interacting with mainly Jews, and other places he's called Saul where he's mainly interacting with Gentiles. But it's sort of this up and down, 6 of one, half dozen the other. But it's not a hard and fast rule that, okay, after the road to Damascus, he's now Paul. It happens that because he's mostly with Gentiles after that, he's understood as Paul more likely. We also have him tell people that he was an apostle, but one who was untimely born. And so he ends up saying to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 11, "For I handed on to you of first importance what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scripture, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas," that's Peter, remember, "then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unfit to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and God's grace toward me has not been in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we proclaim, and so you have come to believe." So Paul is being very clear that he never met Jesus. He was one who was untimely born. Now, it wasn't that he was born after Jesus' resurrection. He was born before that, but he just wasn't around when Jesus was out and about, and he didn't get to meet Jesus in person. And so he uses this to say, I've experienced Christ, resurrected before me on that road to Damascus. I experienced that. And that was Jesus coming to me, and that is how I am one of those messengers or diplomats or, an ambassador, because I met Jesus here. And so he's calling himself an apostle in this context, that he's seen Jesus and he is giving the witness account of the resurrected Jesus. And so he's saying, even if you don't believe me, there's all these other people that have seen him, and you can believe them. And so I'm just passing on what I've been given. So when we end up looking at Paul, we end up seeing a handful of things that pop up for him. And so I'm going to use just a few things because we could do an entire semester-long class on Paul. We could do all kinds of stuff on him. But there's only so much time we have, about 12 minutes if we want to make sure that we get to the painting class on time. So when we look at Paul, we see him there at the stoning of Stephen. So that's Acts chapter 7, verse 58 through 8, verse 3, chapter 8, verse 3. And so this is the first time that Saul shows up. So they say, then they dragged Stephen out of the city and began to stone him. And the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. While they were stoning Stephen, Stephen prayed, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." Then he knelt down and cried out in a loud voice, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." When Stephen had said this, he died. And Saul approved of their killing of him. That day, a severe persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout the countryside of Judea and Samaria. Devout men buried Stephen and made loud lamentation over him. But Saul was ravaging the church by entering house after house. Dragging off both men and women, he committed them to prison. So we see that Saul is there, actively working to make the disciples of Jesus, the believers of the way, repent and come back to Judaism. He was trying for Judaism to be exactly what he had learned it to be, and not this corruption that the followers of Jesus were doing. So he's definitely there, approving of the stoning of Stephen. And then a couple chapters later, we hear Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found anyone who belonged to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now, as he was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" He asked, "Who are you, Lord?" The reply came, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, because they heard the voice but saw no one. Paul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. For 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank. And then it goes on to talk about Ananias, and Ananias being called to come and lay hands on Saul, and Saul having scales, things like scales drop from his eyes so he could see, and then he was baptized. And then he started to preach about Jesus and proclaim Jesus to anyone anyone whom he met. It's interesting that he has this 3 days where he can't see, where he's blind, but also neither eating nor drinking. It's the same thing as Jesus. It's sort of echoing Jesus' death and then his resurrection. And that's through baptism we're connected to the death and the resurrection. So there's already some work in the story of Paul that echoes the gospel. And it'll go on to show that he's doing all kinds of missionary work and, bringing people, to understand the truth of Christianity and spreading that good news in lots of different ways. We also see him doing significant amount of missionary work. And so in Acts 16, we hear about him going and wanting to preach and convert many people. And so I'll start in verse 1 of chapter 16. Paul went on to Derbe and to Lystra, where there was a disciple named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was Greek. He was well spoken by the believers in Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and had him circumcised because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew his father was a Greek. As they went from town to town, they delivered to them for observance the decisions that had been reached by the apostles and elders who were in Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in faith and increased in numbers daily. They went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Spirit to speak the word in Asia province. When they had come opposite Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow them. So passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas. During the night, Paul had a vision. There stood a man of Macedonia pleading with him, saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." When he had had the vision, he immediately tried to cross over to Macedonia, being convinced that God had called us to proclaim the good news to them. We set sail from Troas and took a straight course to Samothrace, the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is the leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. We remained in the city for some days. On the Sabbath day, we went outside the gate by the river where we supposed there was a place of prayer, and we sat down and spoke to the women who had gathered there. A certain woman named Lydia, a worshiper of God, was listening to us. She was from the city of Thyatira and a dealer in purple cloth. The Lord opened her heart to listen eagerly to what was said by Paul. When she and her household were baptized, she urged us, saying, "If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come and stay at my home." And she prevailed upon them. So he does this time and time and time again, going into cities, preaching, sometimes causing a disturbance. We end up having him in Athens, where he preaches, and folks are sort of like, "Oh, a new teaching, tell us more about it." And he's trying to convince them about, that these idols that they have are not worthy of adoration, of worship, and talking about how there is this God who is unknown but now known. And we also have it where he goes to the city of Ephesus, which is in Asia Minor. And it's in present-day Turkey. And if you ever have a chance to go there, it's quite impressive because the harbor silted up, and so the city was just abandoned. and they've started to dig it out, and because no city has grown over the top of it. And it's really impressive to see the theater there. It's impressive to see the library and all kinds of other stuff. And so when he goes to Ephesus, he's telling again about the need to get rid of idols. But Ephesus has one of the wonders of the world. It has the temple to the Greek god Artemis and a huge statue of her that's covered in gold. And the folks there are sort of like, hey, he's telling us to give up these idols. And so we're not going to do that because we make a whole bunch of money from folks buying the little copies that we sell and taking them on. And so if we give up, Artemis, then we'll end up we'll end up losing all of our livelihood. And so they end up going down to the theater and they start shouting for 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of Ephesus." And they do that, and Paul finally has to get out of town because it essentially becomes a mob. Now, we have this sort of information about Paul. He also ends up running afoul of law, and he ends up appealing to the emperor for the emperor to hear his case, and because of that, he has to go to Rome. He goes there and is under house arrest, but there are people that come and go with him and are really helpful, and he's there, and that's where Acts of the Apostles ends. We also do have a number of letters that come from Paul. Now, some of these letters are ones that biblical scholars say these are pretty much Paul's, we're sure of it. And then there's some that, well, it could be, but it could also be someone else. And then there's finally ones that are not likely from Paul. And the way they do this is because they look at the writing style. Now, someone's writing style may change over the years, but the vocabulary can stay fairly similar. The sentence structure and the argumentation can, and they see that there's really a lot of continuity between Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and the letter to Philemon. Those 7 are ones that pretty much all biblical scholars say these were written by Paul. Now, 2 Corinthians, some folks say, is probably a compilation of a couple of letters together, but Paul was probably writing them, or he was the one that was dictating them to folks. Then there's some that it could be, but it also could not be. So Colossians, when you look at it, it doesn't have any sort of the real specifics that we often see in Paul. The 2 Thessalonians, it seems like it goes in a slightly different direction. And it doesn't seem to be exactly where Paul is at theologically on these other ones. But then we get to the letter to the Ephesians, the first and second letter to Timothy and to Titus, and biblical scholars say, this is someone writing after the fact. Now, we remember that sometimes things are written in people's names. So we talked about the gospel according to John, that it might not have been written down by John, but it was written down by his followers a number of years later. Because we end up also having that little postscript that says, he didn't say he would never die. He said that, Jesus said, what is to you if he doesn't die? Didn't say he wasn't going to, but it's possible. And so there is the likelihood that some of the folks that worked closely with Paul ended up writing letters sort of that got attributed to him. So when we think about the letters, we need to just remember that they still carry weight because the church has said, yes, this is inspired by God, even if it wasn't written by Paul. There's still theology in them that helps us understand who God is and what God is doing. Okay. And then finally, wanted to end up giving you a couple of things that are held on in the later tradition, doesn't show up in Scripture. The first thing is that he did arrive in Rome. We hear that he was going to Rome, but we never hear that he actually made it there. But they actually arrived there, and he lived there for 2 years. working with the community to invite people to get to know, Christianity and become that. And finally, he was beheaded. And so he was supposedly beheaded outside the walls of Rome. And there's actually a church that is built in that particular area called St. Paul's outside the walls, which is now in the whole suburban mess of Rome. But and they've actually found a marble sarcophagus. And there is the legend that when his head got cut off, which you can see it there, it's that bright blob there in the corner. It fell on the ground, it bounced 3 times, and each time that it bounced, there was where a spring of water came up. And you can still see those springs of water there in the city of Rome today. So we have a lot of different things going on here. And that's sort of the end of where things are at from my perspective. So let's take a few minutes to talk amongst ourselves and say, so what? What about Paul? What about all these apostles? What difference does it make knowing something of their story for us and our lives as followers of Jesus? Yeah, so if you couldn't hear what Richard was saying, he was saying that it sounded like Paul was a self-appointed apostle. And I think you're absolutely right, that he was. He was absolutely a self-appointed apostle. And I think that there is something in terms of the story that helps us give that space over to him. Because he is doing exactly what the apostles were supposed to be. They are ones who were sent out. They were missionaries, they were messengers, they were diplomats, they were delegates. They had some power, and Paul certainly had that power. He wrote letters to the churches saying, here's how you're supposed to be behaving. You're not doing what you're supposed to do. Exactly, Martin. And so we listen to this and we say, okay, there's definitely something going on here that is, pointing him as someone of import. Additionally, if he's trying to make sure that people listen to his words, he needs to have some spot that helps him say, here's where I have that authority. And so he really does play onto his experience on the road to Damascus. He really does play on that sense of, I encountered Christ after his resurrection, even though it was years later, because it was probably 3 years after the resurrection that Stephen was martyred. And so there's been a long time going on, and so they're trying to figure out, here's how we start to say, this man who persecuted the church is now one of the foremost apologists and one of the foremost, people who's writing things. And remember, who's the one writing Acts of the Apostles? Luke, who's there traveling with Paul. And remember, if it's not in the minutes, it didn't happen. If it's not written down, it didn't happen. And so having it written down puts us into that spot. Now, some of the things that Paul says are absolutely amazing and critical to understanding Christianity. That the Romans 8, For I'm sure that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. I mean, you can't get more, down deep to hit the core of Christianity than that. And so he definitely is saying these things that are very important, and his writings are foundational to Christian theology. And so without him being an apostle, it takes a little bit of that, height of authority away.
His experience on the road to Damascus was a very traumatic experience for him, because he even makes the statement that I know it happened, I experienced it. So that's a convincing point to me that something happened.
Yeah.
He had an overwhelming salvation experience.
Yeah, there's no question. He had an overwhelming experience, just like those other disciples did with Christ's resurrection, and finally also with the gift of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. There is no question that this was a powerful time and experience for him. And so when we're looking at this and we say, okay, how do we deal with the 12 apostles? The church, sort of through the history, has sort of slipped Paul in instead of Matthias, because he has all of that theology and all the writings that are still there that are so core to what we understand Christianity to be. Because remember, Paul's writings are written earlier by almost 30 years than the Gospels. The Gospels are written after Paul has written his letters. And so when we're looking, the Gospels are not copies of his letters, but the Gospels use some of the ideas there, definitely. I mean, remember, we end up looking at Luke, the Gospel according to Luke, and the Acts of the Apostles as written by the same person. And so there's stories that are told, and they're writing them down to keep an orderly account, but it's probably a little ways after the fact, too, especially for Acts of the Apostles. So when we're listening to these stories, we're listening to what the apostles did. They truly did go out. Some of them were more important in the grand scheme of things than others, but all made a difference. All ended up bringing along something that helped Christianity grow and spread so that we are now here 2,000 years later and thousands of miles away from the epicenter of the stories. So I appreciate your time. I appreciate you going with me on this journey. In late January into February, we'll start another set of adult education experiences, probably on Thursday afternoon, that will go with a reprise of something that we did a few years ago that we called Faith Conversations. So we're going to try to get folks from different faith traditions in here, have them talk about their faith and what it means to them and how they practice it. My hope is to have someone from the Hindu Temple of Wisconsin, someone from a Buddhist practice background, someone from Native American background, and then maybe a couple others. If you folks have some ideas, I'd be open to doing that. So we'll end up doing that in the spring. Okay? So thank you everyone for joining us on 966 in our live stream, and thanks for being here with me, and hope you have a great afternoon. And this Advent season is one that brings joy and also closeness to God. Thanks.